Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about Sharpe's eagle. So I didn't intend to make this video. I just sat down to do some painting and I thought I would just watch something, and I figured I'd watch some Sharpe. And the first one I found was Sharpe's eagle, so I put it on. Sharpe's eagle, the TV show. I think it's the second in the series. And this is the first time I've watched Sharpe's eagle since I've read the Sharpe novels. And so I was just watching it and painting some miniatures, and then about halfway through I'm like, oh, okay, there's some differences in the novels here. There's some things that sort of need to be explained because they're not really explained that well in the show, because the movie or show, I'll go back and forth. But there's some things that are sort of like, okay, that needs a little bit more explanation because that's actually quite clever, or because here's why this is being done and maybe people don't understand. So I thought that's what I'll do on the video today. So the first thing that I noticed when watching Sharpe's eagle, and it's really, really clever, and it's very subtle, and unless you knew what it was, you wouldn't have found it. When the South Essex are announced, and when you first see the South Essex, the Rogues March is playing. And then what the Rogues March was the thing that the drummers and fifers would play as you were being punished and flogged. And seeing as that's basically the bread and butter of the South Essex, I think it's said repeatedly, you know, they flog soldiers, they do these floggings, all this sort of stuff. It's fitting to have the Rogues March play. I wish I could play you the Rogues March. I'm not sure if it's copyrighted or not. If it isn't copyrighted, here's the Rogues March. Okay, so a problem with the South Essex, and it's not a problem because I understand why they did it, but the uniforms are wrong. And when I say the uniforms are wrong, I'm not like, well, that button is out of place. The uniforms are actually correct. There's nothing incorrect about them. The shako is correct, and the uniform is correct. It's the shako doesn't match the uniform. I don't know why they did this. The uniforms are men are wearing the Light Company uniforms with the shoulder wings here. Picture there. So the Light Company have the shoulder wings. But the Light Company would also be wearing a shako with a green plume on the top, as opposed to the white over red for the center companies. However, if they had the wings and a white shako, a pure white shako plume, that would be Grenadier companies, the elite. And the reason they did this is because they wanted to show the Light Company, because that's the one we focus most on in the books. It's the one Sharpe becomes captain of, and the 95th the riflemen get sort of merged with. They wanted to do it, but they didn't want to have the green shako thing because that would probably to associate with the riflemen, and they wanted to be able to have like this sheer distinction. So it is an inaccuracy, but it's not something that's been done because of lack of knowledge. I don't think. I think it was done on purpose. Simerson makes a mention to his cousin a few times, and I think Wellesley and a few other people say at the same time, you know, he has friends at Horse Guards, he has a relative at Horse Guards. The relative in Horse Guards is never mentioned, I don't think, in the TV shows, but in the book, the relative is actually Bannister Tarleton. And those of you who may recognise that name, Bannister Tarleton, and not really know where it comes from, he's, if any of you had the misfortune to have to suffer through that awful Patriot movie, he's based on Bannister Tavington, I think his name is, in the awful band Tally, I can't even remember what his name is. He gives you nightmares watching that nonsense, but he was not anywhere near as bad as in the TV show. In the movie, sorry, but that's his relative is Tarleton. The hat with the sort of like cap and the fur running down it that you see is called the Tarleton after him. So that's the cousin he keeps talking about, and that's basically why he skirts pretty much everything bad that happens to him, both in the books and in the movie. Okay, the South Essex, which is never given a number, and I think that's on purpose. Bernard Cornwell just never gave it a number. South Essex is not a real regiment, obviously. It's famous for floggings, but you can't just flog someone. You can't just you are going to be flogged tomorrow. That's not how it works. There were rules. A colonel can't just have people flogged. A colonel could obviously just fake evidence and like bribe people to get someone flogged who had not committed a crime. But there was a process where it was like, okay, you were accused of a crime, you were a British citizen, blah, blah, blah. You have a right to some sort of military tribunal, which obviously the colonel can stack against you, but it does have to happen. You couldn't just flog people. And what was the crime of the guy being flogged? He collapsed, and, well, the crime obviously would then be like he's faking it or something like that. But there was supposed to be some sort of process, and maybe that just wasn't shown. But yeah, the idea that you can just have people flogged, yeah, not true. There were limits of how many lashes you could give someone. I think it was like 100 for a regimental court-martial. Then there were higher court-martials you could go to, which were more lashes, up to I think about like 1,200, which is just death. Anything over 200 is pretty much death. But yeah, so the flogging is actually done properly. Although on a smaller scale, obviously for budgetary reasons. This was filmed in the 90s, and they really only needed one company of men. I think they have like a half company or whatever. But they form a hollow square on 3 sides, a punishment square. Obviously, it'd be the entire battalion. But yeah, for time and purchase, that's fine. And the drummers do the flogging, and this was actually a point of thing between the Navy and the Army. Was, obviously they make jokes back and forth, and the Army would say, something about them doing stuff, and then the Navy would come back with, well, at least we get flogged by men, you get flogged by boys, and then the Army would make a rude comment back at them about some other stuff the Navy does with men, but we're not going to get into that. So yeah, the drummers would do the floggings, and I think the average age of the drummer was like 25, so they're not children. Not always, they could be, but I think, at Waterloo the average age of a drummer in the British Army was 25, So a point of contention that keeps coming up, and I'm not exactly sure what to say about this, because in the books and the movies it's done differently. In the book, Sharpe is a sergeant in Portugal somewhere, and some what are called dragoons, but are clearly lancers or some sort of poles, because they're wearing the zapka or the chapka hats. Yeah, I don't. They call them dragoons repeatedly, and they're clearly not dragoons. They're clearly lancers. Anyway, he shoots them and saves Wellington's life. And yet, in the thing, they keep talking about what he did at Assaye. Well, what he did at Assaye was save Wellington's life. Like, the thing that happens in episode 1 of Sharpe actually happens back in India. And so, I'm not sure how to think, but so what happens is Sharpe is a sergeant. He is around Wellington. His staff, one of Wellington's horse holders gets killed, so Sharpe becomes his aide. Wellington gets himself trapped. Sharpe is with him. Wellington's horse goes down, and a bunch of Indian troops attack him. Sharpe fights them off and saves Wellington's life, where he becomes a lieutenant, an ensign in a Highland regiment. So that's what happens in the book. So that's what they're talking about when they talk about, you keep hearing mentioned like back in India or what you did at Assaye. That's what happened. That's where he actually became an officer. And I mentioned that Sharpe became an ensign, not a lieutenant. Sharpe becomes an ensign in the Highland Regiment, and then he transfers into the rifles, the newly found rifles. But the rifles don't have ensigns because the rifles don't have colours. The rifles have a pennant, different to a colour. And so the rifles have first and second lieutenants. So Sharpe is a second lieutenant, now he's a first lieutenant. So he's technically the army equivalent of a lieutenant. Something else that comes up, you keep hearing this thing about, he's a British officer, so he purchased his commission. That's not true. I should do a whole video on the purchase of commissions, because the vast majority of them were not purchased. Or they were not purchased in the way people think they were purchased. You didn't have to buy a commission if it was a vacancy of death. Like there were ways to be promoted without purchasing commissions. Maybe I shouldn't have said vast majority. Anyway, the South Essex is clearly said to have been a militia regiment formed by Sir Henry Simson. Is he now, or does he later become Sir Henry Simson? Anyway, founded by Henry Simson, and as the rule with the British was that if you formed a militia regiment, you paid for everything. You paid for a whole thing. You could just appoint whatever officers you want. It's the militia. The army doesn't care. So you would generally just appoint people in the local town. You maybe would take bribes from them or commissions. However, regular army officers did have to pay for commissions, with a few exceptions, the biggest one being if you convinced your battalion or your regiment of militia, or a good chunk of them, to transfer into the regular army with you, none of your officers would pay for their own commissions. So technically, none of these guys would have paid for their commissions, unless they had to bribe Simson, or unless, seeing as some of them are actually his relatives, I doubt that. Or maybe someone like Major Leroy or something would have had to buy in. But as a general rule, if you come from militia to the army, you didn't have to pay for your own commission. The stocks are real. Stocks are a standard part of the British thing. It would not have been unusual for British soldiers to wear stocks, especially in the Peninsula. They were got rid of by, it was up to the colonel. A lot of colonels got rid of them. But yes, wearing a stock is not like some punishment thing, or it's not some sort of crazy thing to wear a piece of leather around your neck. Some people will say it's for safety, like if a bit of shell fragment. A slight piece of leather may stop some kind of fragment, but it's not. I doubt it's any sort of armor, because then officers would have worn them instead of those cravat things they used to wear. So yeah, stocks aren't some sort of unique thing to this regiment. people keep keeps coming up in the Sharpe, not so much in the novels, but it does in the show. It's like they act like Sharpe isn't an officer. They keep like coming on to him, and obviously this is part of the whole, is he an officer? Does he fit in with them? But somebody who just like looks at him and they just assume he's not an officer. And I get this is the case in, I think it's in Sharpe's regiment, where he has his shirt off and he's just in pants, like washing himself. But when Sharpe is in his uniform, that is clearly an officer's uniform because it has a sash. If you see somebody in a Napoleonic British Army wearing a red sash, that is an officer. Highlanders normally wore them over the shoulder. If they're wearing a sash, that's an officer. Sergeants and NCOs, other NCOs, would have the red sash with the company facing, 2 red stripes and then the company facing stripe. I think Harper actually has a black one. Black being the facing colour of the 95th. Harper actually has a black one because he's a sergeant in the 95th whose facing colour is black. If you were in a buff regiment, which is sort of like an off-white colour, you would have that. If you were in a someone like the South Essex would have a yellow stripe because their facing colour is yellow. So yeah, the idea that you wouldn't know that this is an officer, you can just clearly look at him. Even if you didn't recognise a rifle uniform, because it is brand new, the rifles are only 6 years old at this point, you would just look at that and go, okay, well, that's an officer, he's wearing an officer's sash. Sharpe says, he's done some fighting before. He's been fighting since the early 90s, early 1790s. I think he's like 35 or something. He doesn't even know his own age. But yeah, Sharpe was with the Duke of York when he went into Flanders. That's where the song comes from, by the way. The grand old Duke of York, he had 10,000 men. That's where the song comes from. Because he dillies about it and does everything. So yeah, that's Sharpe has definitely been fighting for a long time. And obviously he doesn't go into it because he's trying to be clever. Okay, the spit method is something that's the sort of like spit, tap, musket thing. That's something very famous with Sharpe. It's in the novels. Bernard Cornwell was sort of famous for this. It's incredibly dangerous. I'm going to defer to the 2nd 95th on this. The 2nd 95th is an Australian reenactment unit in Victoria, I believe, who have a YouTube channel, and they've made some videos about how incredibly dangerous it is. For those who don't know, what you do with the spit method, it's a gel thing. It is loaded because I need to show you something about it, but it shoots gels. What you do with the spit method is you open the pan, take out your cartridge, bite, spit, prime the pan, close it, that's the bolt, anyway, put the ball in your mouth, pour the powder, and then put your mouth over the barrel, spit the thing in, and then tap it on the ground and fire. Anyone who knows anything about just basic safety, let alone firearm safety, knows that it's not a good idea to put your mouth around the end of a barrel of a loaded weapon, especially a flintlock musket. And I shouldn't have to explain this. I'm not saying it wasn't done. I'm not saying it's not a feasible thing to do. I'm saying it's an incredibly unsafe thing to do. And at a battalion level, which is, we assume this is the battalion that he's training, even though he only trains a company. But to do something like you said at a battalion level, say 500 men for a depleted battalion, and you fire 20 shots in a battle of 800 men, 500 men. So that's how many? 10,000 times that you do this, and in 10,000 times, not one of those muskets goes off. Not one of them goes off at all accidentally. It's just incredibly dangerous. And to show you that, I've got, again, this shoots gels, non-lethal at all gels. Okay, so this shoots gels. And just to show you why it's really not a good idea to do that, this is a very safe thing. You obviously don't point at your own face, but there's a little tissue over the end of that. That's just spring pressure. You don't want that going into the back of your throat with a bullet. And that's a spring from what's essentially a really, really, really toned down friggin' BB gun that shoots foam pellets. Putting your mouth on the end of a gun is not a good idea at all, ever, for any reasons. They repeatedly say that, why don't you go touch your uncle to get money? That does not mean what you think it means. Touch, in this case, just means borrow or ask him for some. And he keeps saying, keep coming to me asking for money. I'm not going to give you any more until Sharpe's dead. So yes, touch your uncle is an old expression for get money from them, not something else that I don't think I can talk about here without getting in some trouble from YouTube. So I've sort of spent this. This is not meant to be some sort of rag video, like this was incorrect. This is literally just like a companion video type thing. Some things they do fantastically well, and this is all in like a 5-minute window. Chin straps for bicorns. Officers wearing straps of chin around their neck. straps of leather around their chins to keep their hats on. Fantastic. As somebody who is here in Australia, and I grew up spent a lot of time at a farm as a kid. Farmers all have these little, normally it's like a hay bale rope around their chins, because your hat will just fly off because it's not glued to your head. Awesome to see that. The British paying for food, because of course the Spanish and their allies, but the British don't steal, the French steal. French don't steal everything, but the French have a policy of they can just take whatever they want, where the British had a policy of paying for things. It's great to see that, they get that brought up again. The Rifle March, that was a real thing. The Rifle March was real. For those who don't know, it's 5 normal steps and then 5 sort of like double running steps. So you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, run, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, run, 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 run. Alternating back and forth. It actually comes up, I think, in Sharpe's regiment, where Sharpe and Harper actually do this with some new guys and embarrass a fat sergeant. But yeah, the Rifle March is a real thing, and it's always used for comedic effect in Sharpe. It's not something that's incorrect, it's just something that's a little weird. Simerson is yelling and commanding his company, his regiment, which is fine, that's perfectly in his character. But generally what would have happened is you have these things called sergeants. Sergeants are very good at yelling, and sergeants are also good for things other than being a contrasting character to an officer. Like, sergeants are actually quite good at screaming and being listened to. And so what an officer would do is they would simply say, move the regiment forward, captain. And then the captain would make the announcement, or he would simply say something like, Sergeant Major, move the men on, and then the Sergeant Major would do his thing. So yeah, generally, it's not wrong for an officer to start screaming and giving orders. Generally, what would have been done is it would have just been like, Sergeant, take them up that road, and then the Sergeant would handle it from there. Teresa's story, Teresa says that, she was once very wealthy and now she isn't. She comes from an aristocratic background, and her story is actually very dark. Like, her family was brutally killed and other stuff was done to them. Well, she sort of saw everything. Yeah, it's very, very dark. It's all, I'm not sure it's explained in the show, but it is in the books. So yes, Teresa is from an aristocratic background. So that's where she's coming from there, linking with the Countessa. Coats. So they have their coats, and they have the, in the Napoleonic fashion, they have the sort of the facing open and the lapels pinned back like that. And you'll notice that they're blue, whereas normally you would expect to see yellow cuffs, yellow collars, yellow lapels. However, that's not a rule. Officers' uniforms were very ill-defined at this point. Up until the 1870s and the 1880s, officer uniforms were pretty much just... There were rules for what you could do. You couldn't just show up in no uniform. There were rules, but they were very relaxed, and regiments often had a lot of control about their own officer uniforms, and even the uniforms of their men. As I mentioned with the stocks, you could just choose not to use them. You couldn't just have whatever uniform you wanted. Those days are long gone. But yeah, you did have some say over it, and in this case, a lot of the officers seem to have gone for the blue. I believe Major Leroy doesn't, but I can't remember 100%. A pointed divergence from the book is that Sharpe borrows the money from Hogan, and this is actually mentioned, you could just borrow the money from Hogan, I'm sure he'd give it to you in the TV show. That's an allusion to, in the book, Sharpe just does borrow the money from Hogan. Not from Captain Leroy. I believe Leroy does what he does in the show. He does that in the book as well, but at a different point and for another reason. Captain Leroy actually comes up a lot more in the book, and his name is Leroy, not Leroy. Although people call him Leroy, it's a French name. It's Captain Leroy, and he's a lot more famous a lot more important in the books. He's actually becomes a lieutenant colonel and is tragically killed. After Ciudad Rodrigo, where Lawford, who we'll get to later, Lawford loses his arm. That's shown in the TV show. He takes over command and he's killed later on. Sharpe actually, in the book, Teresa's not fully around much yet, and Sharpe actually does have a relationship with the Countessa. And at Talavera, or just after it, he finds out that she's actually run off to Lisbon with some cavalry officer. He dies, so it's okay. He later dies. And she's run off with a cavalry officer, and that sort of, puts him down, but it's all right because the cavalry officer dies, and she becomes a lady for hire later on, and Sharpe runs into her again later on. So, not in the TV shows, she's done after this, but in the book, she's a recurring character. Okay, 2 things. These are going to be 2 points. One, you don't kneel. There is no kneeling and firing anymore. That went out before the French and Indian War, I believe. I think it was 1750s that went out. You don't kneel to fire anymore. That's why the British are in 2 lines, because you can just fire from 2 lines. You could even do it in 3, but yeah, kneeling and firing is not something that happens. You will often see a lot of artwork of soldiers with a dirty knee. This is from the earlier period, from the sort of 1750s and a bit earlier. They may have done it during the French Indian War. I'm not 100% about that. I haven't. I know it ended around that time, but whether or not it continued over into the sort of the 1750s and 60s, I'm going to have to... I might even make a video about kneeling and firing. But yeah, it was not done in the Napoleonic Wars. Maybe on a company scale like this, if that was indeed the light company, maybe there would have been some kneeling, but not in a ranked volley system. It was done for squares. As a defense against cavalry, you put your musket on the ground and wedge it and kneel down like that. But in a stand-up fight, you wouldn't kneel to fire. Yeah. And in the book, the cavalry, there aren't any infantry, it's just all dragoons. Dragoons are very common in the peninsula. If there were French cavalry in the peninsula, it's almost guaranteed they're dragoons. Polish lancers or dragoons. I think it was like 20-something regiments of dragoons, or 15. So yeah, the most common type of cavalry in the peninsula were dragoons, and that's who Sharpe comes up against. I believe those lancers are meant to be Polish lancers. They're not wearing the opulent Polish uniform. I'm not sure what those are meant to be in the show. Lancers of some kind, because they're wearing the chapkas or the zapkas, or the funny like four-thing helmet, the four-thing hat the British would later adopt for their own lancers. Though I assume they're meant to be Polish lancers. They do carry lances, let's say. Losing the colours is extremely bad. I'm not sure... the movie does make it quite clear that this is not a good thing. It's incredibly bad. The British did not lose any colours in the Peninsular War, in the Napoleonic Wars at all, at least not permanently. The 5th KGL, we've talked about those before in my La Haye Sainte videos. The 5th KGL, when Umteda was ordered to charge La Haye Sainte with them, and they got absolutely massacred, they did lose their colours, but they were given back to them a few days later by a KGL hussar of some kind. The 8th KGL also lost their colours at that point, but a sergeant retrieved them just before the French could ride off with them. I believe the last time the British lost colours was in 1778 at Cowpens, back in the American Revolution. So yeah, losing the British colours was a giant deal. Obviously, the reason, this is in the book and the show, the reason the British lose their colours is because the Sharpe then retakes the colours, and that gives some honour back to the regiment, and they add a chained eagle to their regimental flag. I don't believe the South Essex actually get a King's colour back until after they take a French colour. So that's why you see them later on with just the South Essex regimental colour, the second colour, as opposed to the first colour, which would be obviously the King's colour. I believe the next time the British would lose a colour would be in 1879 at Isandlwana. Although, of course, they didn't lose the colour at Isandlwana. That I'm actually going to make a video about that, about Melville and Coghill. What happened was the lieutenants went into the Buffalo River, were killed, the colours washed down the Buffalo River, and were retrieved about 10 or 12 days later by men of the 24th. So technically, yeah, the losing a colour was extremely rare. The 44th lost theirs at Kabul because of Elphinstone being utterly incompetent and weak, but that was given back to them in the peace treaty. So yeah, losing colours was not a good thing. The French did lose some colours in the peninsula, not at Talavera though, it was later on. I think it was 1811. Yeah, 1811, Sergeant Masterson actually took a French eagle. And there was another French eagle taken, but it was cut up because they thought it was gold, where the French eagles were not gold, they were covered in gold. The one Masterson took actually has bullet holes in it from where it's been shot. So yeah, there were French eagles taken. I believe there was some taken at Waterloo too. Anyway, that's far beyond this. But yes, losing a colour is extremely bad. For it happened to a British officer, that would be suicide, career suicide, and I doubt even friends at Horse Guards, especially those of dubious reputation as Tarleton, would be able to get you out of that. Simmerson absolutely would be disgraced. He does show up later on, but yeah, utter disgrace for doing that. And when Hogan actually says, you should go around the back and blow your brains out, the British wouldn't demand that of you, but if you had done that, you probably would have saved a bit of honour. Obviously, not to the extent of something like a Japanese sense of honour, but yeah, it maybe wouldn't have been the worst thing for Simmerson to do, but seeing as he had connections, he turned out alright for him. Okay, so Lawford, I've got a few notes about Lawford, but I'll put them here as well. Lawford is a British officer who we meet in Sharpe's Tiger, the first book. Oh, I really should really stop doing these tangents so much, but if you're reading the Sharpe's books, read them in the order that they happen. So read them in the chronological order, not the order that they are published. However, if you're going to read the Flashman books, read them in the order that they were published, not the chronological order. So Sharpe, chronological, Flashman, published. Anyway, just a quick rule. Lawford we meet as a lieutenant, who is the cousin or the nephew of Hector McCandles, who is basically the guy Sharpe and Lawford infiltrate Seringapatam to get McCandles out of prison, but Hagesville betrays them. That actually happens in Sharpe's Tiger, where Sharpe and Harper try and infiltrate the Tipu Sultan's palace or something. I believe in one of the later episodes, Sharpe says, I actually have killed the Tipu Sultan, which he did, but he never admitted to because he got a whole lot of jewels and gold off the Tipu Sultan. Anyway, and Lawford does teach Sharpe to read with a piece of a Bible, and Lawford helps Sharpe out a few more times. He's actually the company commander of the light company, the regiment that Sharpe is involved with. And so William Lawford is very important to Sharpe. He's a huge father figure to him, and I don't think it's made very clear in the TV show just how much of a father figure Lawford is. And when he's wounded at Ciudad Rodrigo, that's a big deal. So he's not. I think there's like a joke, it's like Simpson's going on about the Irish because he's clearly going on about Hogan being Irish, but this and then one of his brainless nephews says something like, "I don't think Lawford is Irish. Lawford is Scottish." For those who are wondering, he's the nephew of Hector McCandles, who was a very very out and out Scottish officer. The quote, "I don't fight duels over whores." That's meant to be this after basically a rape. In the show, that's meant to be some sort of like disparaging comment to the Countessa. Although it's sort of a slight nod to the books, because in the books she does later become a prostitute. So it's sort of like a little nod to the book in that it's a bold statement to make in the show, but it's also a little nod to the book of like, hey, this is where it goes. The patrol at night happens pretty much exactly as it is in the show. He kills Berry, or one of them. He kills one of them. And the dueling, okay, the night patrol happens as it does in the show. Sharpe is sent off. But there is a reason, and there is a reason that you can't duel, and that's because it was illegal. It wasn't like a thing about British officers like, oh, you can't duel in the Peninsula. Wellington never gave an explicit order saying you couldn't. As a general rule, the more senior an officer, the less they liked dueling, because what dueling did was kill officers. Like, it's quite obvious. I don't think it needs to be said, but if your officers start stabbing and shooting one another, you have less officers. So it was illegal to do. Wellington himself actually fought a duel in the 30s over his stance on Catholic emancipation, where he was pro-Catholic emancipation, and someone else thought that he was trying to have like you're trying to have the country taken over by these Catholics, and he's like, well, how about we just let them vote? And anyway, he himself fought a duel later on. So that's something that shows up in Cornwell's work a lot. Is Wellesley being very anti-dueling, where it was actually just against the law. There are actually cases, I believe, in the Navy where people were prosecuted for not accepting duels because it was like, well, you can't serve in the Navy if you have no honour, and if you decline a duel, then you're showing that you have no honour. And it's like, yes, but if I accept the duel, then I'm a criminal. It's like, well, no. They were very rare. I think it was like 10 of them. But yeah, as a general rule, you couldn't be in the army if you didn't have honour, and you couldn't duel because it was illegal, but if you were challenged to a duel and you declined it, then where is your honour? Whereas if you accept it, you're a criminal. So this catch-22 that Sharpe's in, is fully real. Like, I think he says, damned if you do, damned if you don't. If he fights the duel and wins, then he'll be punished. If he fights the duel and loses, then he'll be dead. So it's exactly what would have happened in real life. You would have been prosecuted. Probably wouldn't have been prosecuted. But you probably wouldn't have been prosecuted as just a normal guy. But if Wellington himself, at this point, Sir Arthur Wellesley, he becomes Wellington in a few days' time. But if Sir Arthur Wellesley himself had told you not to duel and you went and did it, you would absolutely be, your career's over. You may even be prosecuted for it. So that's the sort of dueling that comes up a lot in the Sharpe novels and books. Novels and TV shows, that dueling was not something Wellington himself forbade. It was something the English law forbade. So take that as you are. I've seen some people say, well, why doesn't the French eagle have a flag on it? A lot of the eagles didn't have the flags. A lot of the flags were just left behind at the depots. The eagle itself was a symbol enough, especially since the eagle is a callback to the Roman eagles on the top of the Aquilifers, I believe they were called. That's where Aquila, if it depends on the Latin pronunciation, you use Aquila means eagle. Aquilifer, depends on how you pronounce it in Latin, means eagle bearer or protector of eagle or something like that. And so that was the eagle standard. and so the French adopted the eagle for their own thing, and you didn't always need a flag on it. So yeah, not having a flag on an eagle is perfectly fine. Having an eagle just be taken from what looks like just a regular soldier is not perfectly fine. In the books, they actually have to fight through axe-wielding sergeants, which is what you would have had. You would have had, I believe I'll find a picture of some sergeants, colour sergeants and that sort of thing, who would have had giant halberds and defending the eagle, and it would have been heavily defended. The whole pride of the regiment is surrounded by this eagle or this king's colour. It's the same thing. And yeah, Sharpe and Harper have a big struggle to take this eagle, and this is actually in the book. This is where Gibbons attacks Sharpe, and then Harper kills Gibbons, and Sharpe takes Gibbons' locket, and in his locket is actually a picture of his wife, who Sharpe would later marry, because you kill someone's brother and then marry them, and then she takes all your money and runs off with you and cuckolds you with a British officer. So yeah, I guess you sort of say he got his just desserts for that one. But anyway, that's what happens in the book. In the movie, he just takes the colour, and then they sort of just wrap everything up all nice, which is fine. It's not a huge divergence. Sharpe's eagle is actually quite close to what happens in the book, so it's not a huge divergence. Some of the other ones are massive. Some of the books aren't even made into TV shows. I don't think the Fuentes de Honore thing happens at all. A lot of the stuff that happens in Portugal doesn't happen in the TV shows. They just don't show it. There's some stuff around the Terra Verdes. I never can say that properly, but there's like a Portuguese officer that follows around Sharpe for like 3 books that you don't see because those books aren't covered. There's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in Chile, and he meets Napoleon on St. Helena, and that's anyway. I'm rambling now at this point, sorry. Yeah. So the last thing I'll say is that Lawford takes command over the regiment. Sorry, I call it a company because that's what you see in the show, but that's meant to be a regiment. Lawford takes command of the regiment after Sir Henry Simson flees. At that point, he's utterly disgraced. Not Captain Leroy. Leroy would end up taking command after Lawford is injured. And Lennox is a captain, not a major, in the book. I don't know why they probably did that to show that he's sort of like this older guy, and he's above Leroy and above all the other petty lieutenants and captains and that sort of thing. That's probably why they did it. There would also be a lot more officers for a regiment that size. You would have 1, maybe 2 majors, probably 1, 10 captains with maybe 10 or even up to 20 lieutenants, and then a couple of ensigns. Like that would be 30 to 40 officers following a regiment around, plus some guys, some gentleman ranker types, maybe depending on how famous the regiment is. Like to have a small tent with officers in it, you can have like an inner circle of officers. Maybe you have like an aristocratic lieutenant and some friends, and they dine with you personally, as opposed to just in the officers' mess. But yeah, I mean, this is obviously a scaled down regiment for a number of reasons: characters, uniforms, budget, time. So it's fine. But in real life, you would expect to have regiments are much larger than what we're seeing in here. So again, not a critique, just something to bear in mind. So thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to see reviews of the other Sharpe things, I'm going to be watching them, so all I have to do is get my notepad out and start taking notes as I see things. If you'd like to see them, let me know, and I'll post them up on the channel. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful day.